more it looks like the Federal Reserve is making progress on bringing inflation back down, the weaker the US dollar gets. It's the weak US dollar that's going to be instrumental in raising the inflation rate back up. So in other words, the Fed is a victim of its own success, even though it's not real success to the extent that the market perceives that there's success. That is sowing the seeds of failure. One of the main reasons that US inflation hasn't been much higher, other than the fact that we lie about it in the official statistics, has been the relative strength of the dollar. Not in absolute sense, because the dollar is obviously losing purchasing power, but in foreign exchange markets, on a relative basis, it has been extremely strong until the last 8 weeks against all the other currencies in the world, and that has helped diminish the impact that inflation has on prices, because as inflation was driving prices up, the relative strength of the dollar was pushing them back down. And so there was an offsetting effect which mitigated the increases. The flip side of that, of course, is that in Europe, it's the opposite effect. The weakness in the euro was exacerbating the increase in consumer prices over there, because not only did they have to deal with the effects of their own inflation, but they had to deal with the reduced value of the euro in relationship to the dollar. But now that the tables have turned and that the dollar is now falling, now we're going to have to get a taste of our own medicine. We're going to start to see this impact our consumer prices, except it's not going to happen right away. There is going to be a bit of a lag, but by some point, maybe early to mid 2023, the weaker dollar is going to start to show up in higher consumer prices. Number one, it's going to immediately increase our import bill, because now we're going to have to pay a lot more to import those products. It's also going to increase the cost of transporting those products to the United States, because a weaker dollar is going to drive up both fuel costs and other shipping rates. And of course, all of this has bad implications for US GDP. Remember, the only reason that we got positive GDP in Q3 was because the trade deficit was a lot smaller than it otherwise would have been. And one of the main reasons for that was the strength of the dollar, which brought down the cost of our imports. Now, of course, we also had the ability to export all that oil from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. Of course, we're going to exhaust that at some point, and so we're not going to be able to prop up our trade with Strategic Petroleum Reserves. But once the dollar really starts to fall, that process gets reversed when it comes to cheaper imports. We're going to have to be paying through the nose for those imports, and that is going to subtract from GDP, but it's also going to exert more downward pressure on the economy because of the upward pressure on consumer prices. Walmart is reporting that one of the reasons that it's having higher sales is because more affluent households are now doing their grocery shopping at Walmart. And these are households with incomes over $100,000. Now, why are more affluent households shopping at Walmart? Well, it's because they can't afford to shop at the more expensive, fancier markets that they used to go to, because prices are up so much. In order to put food on their tables, they're having to trade down and buy cheaper stuff at Walmart. Now, the typical Walmart shopper, what they're doing to make do is they're trading down in quality. So the types of food that they're buying are of a lower quality than what they used to buy. So the proteins, instead of buying steak, for example, they buy hamburger or hot dogs, stuff like that. They find ways to stretch their shrinking dollars. Also, consumers, according to Walmart, are cutting back on the name brands, and they're buying more of the generic products. Now, a lot of these products are Walmart's own products, so they probably have higher margin when someone buys a generic than when they do a brand name. And so that's also benefiting Walmart. But one of the things that is hurting Walmart, and they reported on this, is declining overall margins, because as their customers are having to pay more for food, they have less money left over for other merchandise that they used to buy, and that merchandise has a higher markup than food. And of course, it's not just the food that they're buying at Walmart that is more expensive. It's the energy that they have to buy, the gas they have to buy to get to Walmart, the energy cost of heating or air conditioning their homes, as well as their rents or their mortgage payments, their insurance. The cost of living is rising in general, and so discretionary income is falling, And so sales of the types of items that people would buy using their discretionary income, they're also falling. And so that ultimately is bad news for Walmart, that maybe was using food as more of a loss leader, although not a loss leader, but trying to get people in the door to buy their groceries. But just while they're there, selling them a lot more expensive stuff, well, they can't afford. And all that expensive stuff is going to get even more expensive now that the US dollar is falling instead of rising. Now, another way that Walmart customers are paying for the food that they're buying is through their credit cards, because we also got news from the Federal Reserve that we just had the biggest increase in household credit in 15 years, driven by mortgage debt and credit card debt. In fact, the increase in credit card debt is the biggest in 20 years. Household debt now stands at an all-time record high, $16.5 trillion. It's up $1.27 trillion in the last year. Again, a surge in household debt is not a sign of a booming economy. The reason for this is strong demand. American consumers have strong demand, and so they're buying a lot of stuff and they're running up their credit card bills. Well, if we had a strong economy that was behind that strong demand, consumers wouldn't need to use their credit cards to buy stuff. They would buy stuff with the money they earn from their jobs in a strong economy. The fact that consumers have to go into debt to buy shows they can't afford to buy the things they're buying. Now, I think one of the reasons they're going into debt to buy is because they're going into debt to buy food. They need to eat, and the only way they can afford to do it is if they charge it. So this is not a strong economy, this is a weak economy. And as I've explained many times, the evidence of economic strength is a rise in the savings rate. When people are more affluent, they have more savings. They pay off their debt. When times are tough, they dip into their savings and run up the debt, and that is exactly what we're doing right now. But what's also problematic about this surge in mortgage debt and credit card debt is that interest rates are also soaring. So in contrast to what Americans should be doing when rates are rising, which is reducing their debt, because then they would have a lower burden of servicing that debt, American households are going deeper into debt, even as the cost of servicing that debt is going up. That means a real economic disaster, because we have record high mortgage debt, record high credit card debt, and now the cost of financing that debt is going up. And in fact, I read one report in particular about debt that people are running up on their store cards. So these are not the big banks. This is when you get a credit card issued directly by a merchant, so you can only use it at that merchant. Well, the interest rates that those merchants are charging out is, I think, 25%. That is an enormous rate of interest for somebody to buy. If you can't afford to buy something, and so you borrow to buy it instead, and now not only do you have to pay for the product, but you have to pay 25% interest every year to pay for what you bought, that adds up very quickly, and ultimately the cost is compounded. It costs way more to buy an item when interest rates are that high, because every 4 years you're buying the item all over again, even though you've already used it. Now, of course, a lot of the people who are running up this debt are not going to pay it back. They're going to default. They're going to go bankrupt. Yes, the delinquency rates are still low, but the emphasis there is still, because these rates are going to rise, especially as home equity starts to evaporate, because real estate prices are falling, used car values are falling. Again, this is not deflation. This does not mean the Fed is winning on inflation, because even though the price of a house is coming down, the cost of owning it is still soaring. Even though the value of a used car is going down, the cost to an American to buy that used car is still going up.